You're listening to The Inversion Investor. The Inversion Investor. The Inversion Investor.
Hello, Doug Casey. Finally, great to speak to you again. Do you remember the last time we spoke?
It's been quite a while ago, Peter, but it's nice to talk to you again. Likewise.
So, in terms of the podcast, the last time we spoke, it sounded like you had won a massive wager because I believe that you had wagered for Trump on that time. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do. That was in the 2016 election. I
Yes.
made a bet with Marin Katusa,
Okay.
and we bet 100 ounces of silver that I bet that Trump would win. My only mistake was considering it as a gentleman's bet, and I could have gotten at least 4 or 5 to 1 odds, which I should have, but
Right.
it's just a gentleman's bet. So, yeah, I bet that Trump was going to win, and I was right. And in this last election in 2020, I bet that Biden was going to win. And I gave a number of reasons for that, but mainly that the Democrats historically are much, much better at stealing elections than the Republicans. And now in office in Washington, we have hardcore Bolsheviks. And by that, I mean people that share the ideals and the psychology of the Bolsheviks that took over Russia in 1917. They're exactly the same people, which is to say the same people that took over France in 1789, or for that matter, were running rampant in China in the 1960s. These people have the same psychological and moral and intellectual profile as all those people. They're very dangerous, and they're not going to let go of the reins of power. So hang on to your hat.
So what is one to do in this kind of environment? I know that you recently wrote something about being free in an unfree world, and I would preface that by saying that spending time in Asia, I mentioned to people in the region, or I mean, for goodness sakes, even in Australia. You know what's so surprising is that they don't value freedom like that, Doug. I think that you had wrote that as well. It was one of the most interesting lines. It was like kind of like the upper class is about values. And it seems like when you try to get to this high level of thinking, according, let's say to them, they would call that high level of thinking, that they just want to be able to get by, which I think you identified as the middle class. But then even their eagerness to get by, I actually refer to a lot of the activity in Asia as kind of like prisoner's dilemma. So you have a state that's implementing draconian policies, and due to so many different reasons, being able to identify additional reasons which they blame on a virus, and then they also blame it to various different identity groups as a cause of this virus. And as a result, what's fascinating is then you add draconian lockdowns, but then if you built a society with lackluster infrastructure, even if people are all staying at home in isolation, they're still catching it. So what's fascinating is I refer to some of my friends and my colleagues is that if you followed every single rule and you were a good participant in this game, let's call it that, you'd only be so screwed. So I guess my question, going back to what was originally asked, is that what is one to do with all the craziness that's going on in our world?
Yeah, well, increasingly, we live in a world where everything that is not mandatory is prohibited and vice versa. So I don't know exactly what you can do except to try to become independently wealthy enough to insulate yourself from the stupidity to some degree. In addition to that, don't live in a major city, don't live in an apartment, and hope that this mass psychosis, which has overtaken the world, blows away. But, the powers that be out there, let's say, with the kind of views that the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab have, uh, they really want to see the great mass of people own nothing and be happy. And that seems to be the way the world is going. People are much more interested in just having stuff than they are in doing stuff, and much more and that than being something themselves. So I'm pessimistic.
You know what was fascinating? Again, a perspective from Asia is that you would imagine, I guess that the brainwashing is just so massive in this region because it's been basically overall submissive society overall. It's always had some form of like monarch or dictator, and a lot of the policies throughout generations just get passed by. So then, even though a lot of Southeast Asia is effectively under martial law, you would assume that based on all the media and movies and content that people would be cognizant of what's happened to them. This probably applies to even Australia and New Zealand as well. But what's fascinating, Doug, is that they've actually repositioned, like corrupt authorities have been repositioned as saviors, even though they're the ones who took everything away. And in some places, I shouldn't be naming many places because that might not be good for me, but a lot of places that are under martial law, what they've done, Doug, is on social media, they've drawn the images of the military like in a very Disney animation style. They've softened the image of the military, and they've made the very same crony, corrupt individuals and bureaucrats look as if they're saviors. And so surprisingly, Doug, is that 99% of the entire population, under the premise of fear, totally idolizes these people. And it's just so fascinating. And I try to indicate, because a lot of people, they don't understand. They're like, well, we see this happening all over in the world. And I said, I suspect, I guess for most of the Western world, maybe only 30% of people are cognizant of it. And I suspect maybe in America, like 40 something percent are aware or value these things. But to the rest of the world, wow. And it is truly one of the most shocking and surprising things I've ever witnessed. And I myself personally need to get out of there because I cannot be in an environment with just everyone being a conformist.
Well, I understand, and you're quite correct, Peter. I think that right now, the world is about where it was in 1939. So the question becomes, where do you go where you can get away from these crazy chimpanzees and live someplace peacefully and productively where you won't get caught up in the mobs around the world? There's a story, it's apocryphal, I'm sure, of a guy that in 1939 saw the winds of war starting to blow around the world. So he figured he'd go to the most obscure and out of the way place possible so that he wouldn't be washed away. So he bought a copra farm in the Solomon Islands on the island of Guadalcanal. So it seemed like a good idea at the time to hide, but you can run, but you can't hide, especially in today's world. There's no place you can hide, and especially if the United States collapses with the people that are in charge in Washington. I don't know where you go. And incidentally, one thing you said earlier about corrupt people have taken over a lot of the governments in the world. No, they're just the normal people that run governments, because you've got two kinds of people in the world. You've got people that like to control the physical universe, create things, do things, and you got people that like to control other people. And it's people that like to control other people that inevitably go into government. And whenever you have a crisis, whether it's real or manufactured, like this COVID thing, they use it as an opportunity to increase their control, because that's
Right.
what they like, controlling other people.
Right. And then I just figure it's kind of like I wouldn't blame them, because think about it, Doug, like if like a majority of your population just fall by every single like new directive, I think the end game for the state is basically 100% of GDP, right? Like, and you see it happening in China right now, right? Like, it's fascinating. Like, what the communists have done is basically they pretended to liberalize a little bit to get in all that Western money, and then in this opportune time, what they've done is basically kind of like eradicated the idea of liberalizing their markets, and that is that's what's happening. I think this is also connected to what the audience should do. Is that one subject I want to talk to you is about supply chains, and I'll share to you like what I see in boots on the ground in Asia, and you can see it in Afghanistan, is that all the social justice messages in America are only designed to stimulate the consumer base, because that's a high GDP per capita demographic, which is basically the primary market that's going to be buying, let's say, Nike goods or Intel products. Now, the sweatshops that they have here, what's fascinating is their chambers of commerce or their embassies are advocating the U.S. to basically export vaccines to these developing countries. What's happening is as soon as the vaccine arrives, it's not going to the American or the expat that's residing in these places, and it's not really going to the overall populace. It's going to the workers of the sweatshops of the multinationals, and I find that to be a great obvious hypocrisy, in which in mainland America you hear about the value of every single minority group, which sounds great, right? The whole issue is that, and you can see it in the Afghanistan exit, is that you have some Afghanis that might be connected to, let's say, the deep state or multinationals that were able to hop on a plane, but then you have just like, let's say, a lower priority American that could be just left stranded. So what's happening is that in frontier Asia, a lot of Americans still haven't got vaccinated. And then what's ironic is that you have like workers at Intel or Nike that are sleeping in tents in these factories to avoid directives and protocols, and are getting access, if they so desire, actually mandatory, for them to be able to continue to work. So this one thing I will say for sure, Doug, is that this COVID has revealed the absolute truth to everyone, and it is imperative for people to be keen observers of what's happening and understanding all the signals in order to capture what I call the pockets of light, because this isn't really about a destination you can go to. It's about finding like-minded people just to work with in order to get by. This isn't really about the official nation state. It's about maybe a Discord chat group or something of that nature, or a mailing list or a community chat group in which people of like minds are able to work together to, I guess, build their own arc. So that's really interesting. I wanted to share that, and I'm going to take that to another level as well. But I'd love to hear what you think about this.
Well, I'm a libertarian, which means I believe in free minds and free markets, basically minding my own business otherwise. And my suspicion is that only about 2% of the world's population are real libertarians.
Yeah.
Most people are busybodies, basically. And they like the idea of a government ordering things and telling them what to do and what not to do. So my prognosis is not very good for the years to come. The bad guys are in control. So, like I said earlier, it's just a question of where can you go, where you can live your life peaceably and productively without being bothered. There aren't many places left in the world. And insofar as there are, that's the main reason for having money, to insulate yourself from from busybodies that are trying to tell you what to do and what not to do. So that's kind of the way the world is.
Right, right. I think just to add to the money thing is also the time, right, to do the adequate research in order to protect yourself, right? Because obviously, I think that's I've heard, like, time is a luxury as well, right? You need, not everyone, because I hear this a lot, right? Because everyone's just trying to scrimmage out a living. And then what they say to me is like, oh, Peter, not everyone can just sit there under a tree and just like philosophize every day and then examine about the nuances of what's healthy for you and what's not healthy for you. That's what they say, right? And I've come, like you said, they're part of the narrative that needs to happen in order for the world to function. I've heard this, Doug, is that a lot of people need a hierarchy. It's almost natural for us to crave a hierarchy in some capacity. You could see it during, I guess, the colonial days as well, is that you could have, if you had, like in India, for example, if you had people reporting to, I guess, like the British, they would fight for a spot. Or during the slave times in America as well, like there would people want to fight for a position. So there's always a need for it's human nature almost to desire that hierarchy. And I guess that's where, in terms of like religion, I see the value of that, in which at least you can say that, hey guys, no one is perfect, no one is a deity. And perhaps the distraction point that we could say is that there is this deity in, let's say, a religion that you could at least focus on, just so that you can be as humble enough to know that you yourself cannot be the master of the universe, and then therefore question the bureaucratic structure that is telling you what exactly to do. And then hopefully that allows you to give you because you then fear no man, then it forces you to think on how to fend for yourself.
Well, that's a good explanation of why people value religion. But people are basically like dogs or horses, or for that matter, other members of the anthropoid family. And there's always a top dog, or the big silverback gorilla. So yeah, people structure themselves in a hierarchy. Now, personally, I don't like hierarchies. I'm what you might call a gamma rat. Alpha rats dominate the beta rats.
Right.
And the alpha rats take the best territory and the best mates and all this type of thing, and the beta rats just take what's given to them. I've always preferred to hang out with other gamma rats. In other words, we get the best territory and the mates, but we don't like to dominate the beta rats.
Correct.
And we're a small minority.
Which is basically true. I probably not the best point, but I might as well just say it. It's kind of like the one you kind of admire is the one that has the ability to exert that much power and force towards you, but chooses not to, right? And that's something that the typical alpha or bureaucrat can't stomach. He needs to exert that, because that's how he gets his ego trip.
You're right. You're absolutely correct. And interestingly, to explore these subjects, that's why I've gotten into writing novels in recent years, as opposed to nonfiction. Nobody's terribly interested in people's idle philosophizing in nonfiction. So I decided to put these thoughts in a series of novels. And in fact, I happen to have anybody that's written a novel likes to promote it at any opportunity possible. This is the most recent of them. It's part of a series of 7. The first one was Speculator, reforming the occupation of the speculator, where our hero, Charles Knight, engages in a bush war in Africa. And the second one is Drug Lord, where he comes back to the U.S. and becomes a drug lord, showing that a drug lord can be a good guy. They're not all bad guys.
Mm.
And in this book, we explore the idea of political assassination, where if people are trying to ruin your life and tell you what to do and basically destroy the world, do you have a right to engage in political assassination? Good, bad, right, wrong, effective, ineffective. Anyway, that's Assassin, and I want to urge your listeners and viewers to read this. It's a hell of a good read with a lot of philosophical thoughts intertwined in the story.
Can I ask a question about the books, Doug?
Oh, by all means.
So in terms of people have kind of like suggested that George Lucas wrote Star Wars basically as himself, right? So Luke Skywalker, George Lucas, basically kind of like that's George Lucas, basically, is Luke Skywalker, is what some people say. Is this series of books semi-autobiographical, Doug Casey?
It's long been said that everybody's first novel is at least semi-autobiographical or biographical. Right. So, yes, because you want to write what you know. And Speculator is most like that, obviously, because I've spent a lot of time in Africa, and it's about a gold mining fraud and things of that nature. So it's quite interesting from the point of view of people that are involved in the markets. And drug lord, well, like a lot of people in their 20s, I thought about getting into the drug business, didn't, took another path. And assassin, no, I'm not currently assassinating anybody, but sure, you've got to write about what you're interested in and things that you know. Charles is next going to become a terrorist or be accused of being a terrorist. Terrorism is an interesting method of warfare. That's all it is. It's the biggest bugaboo in the world now. But
right.
It's just like cavalry charges or infantry assaults. It's just a tactic. So that's the next book that we're going to write. Then after that, he goes back to Africa and becomes a warlord. Everybody's supposed to hate warlords.
Right.
But, so anyway, that's what I'm doing these days, Peter, exploring these subjects in the form of fiction. There are things that you can say in the form of fiction that you dare not say in the form of fiction.
I was going to ask about that, is that since we last spoke, a lot has also changed in the world in terms of like cancel culture as well. That's sort of a kind of like identity assassination. Is my question for you is that I suspect that are you feeling the brunt force of cancel culture because you tend to speak your mind, and what are your thoughts on that? Has that affected your ability to get your message out?
Yeah, I say whatever I want.
Right.
Time that I want, because I'm not employed by anybody. I don't need anybody else's approval, either commercially or intellectually. I have a YouTube podcast channel called Doug Casey's Take. It's still up there where I say everything. I have a blog site called internationalman.com where I write an article once a week. Nobody's tried to take that down yet either. So maybe I'm just lucky.
So you haven't, like, there haven't been instances in which, like, say, for example, speaking engagements were canceled, or some maybe videos on YouTube might have been like demonetized or something like.
Nope.
That's fascinating.
So these things are happening where they are canceling people and taking them down for saying politically incorrect things, et cetera, et cetera. But so far, I'm unscathed.
That's great. That's great. So let's just jump to probably the final two subjects, which is the supply chain. I know that you have some perspectives on that. Could you share a little bit about that as well? And I'd like to share a take as well on that too. So I'd love to hear what you think.
Well, this COVID hysteria, and it's actually gone beyond being just a hysteria. It's turned into a mass psychosis. The U.S. government used that as an excuse to do several things, to legally make forbearance on rents, where there's something like 7 million households who haven't had to pay rent for the last year, and about 2.5 million households that have not had to pay their mortgages. So that's just great for them. And at the same time, they've been getting, in addition to unemployment, not working, they've been getting up to $600 per person per week extra. Now, what has that done? It's helped to destroy supply chains. People are not working because they're afraid of COVID. Their employers are shut down because of COVID. And at the same time, there's a lot more demand in the way of extra money that's available for them to spend on things. So this has stretched supply chains. There's less production and more demands on consumption. And I'm not sure it's going to get better soon, because people have been so corrupted by not working and being paid for not working over the last year that they've acquired bad habits that they don't have to break because of government policies. So this supply chain thing is going to be with us for some time, the disruptions thereof.
From if I could add to that, is that from a global context, the way I think of it, especially since everything has transpired the way that it did, I quite simply divide the world, let's say the Western world, which is basically the demand side, and then the rest of the world is kind of like the I guess the low end supply side. And the way that I think of it now, Doug, is basically perhaps these individuals could be moderately unproductive, let's say in America, but they still have a credit facility. And if you notice, about like a few years ago, the Chinese seem to have a bizarre interest in hacking U.S. Credit data. I have a few suspicions about this, but one could simply just to understand that these are the people that have the means to be able to purchase the goods that are being manufactured. I think that when in Asia, what I've seen is that true proof that the trade war was at the crux of everything in our world is the very fact that everything else has been locked down, with exception if you're a government bureaucrat, or if you work in manufacturing, or if you work in trade. These are probably the most freest people in supply chain Asia, while everyone else is locked down. And then what's fascinating, Doug, is if you take a look at like GDPs in all of Asia, like China's got like this nice print of like 6%. But if you know that a lot of the people are not working, and that only trade and manufacturing and industry seems to be sufficient enough, because I've always said that 80% of GDP is altered by basically the state, and that they could game it. So then, as opposed to getting a print of 6.5%, if you're gaming 80% of it, you're already at like 6. It's sufficient enough. And what I have come to identify was that the trade war or trade has financed that. I mean, that's one of the byproducts of what so many people were talking about, is that this gave these countries the economic surpluses from America in order to dramatically implement draconian policies and to take over the entire economy of some of these countries. And this really just solidifies the idea that it was the multinational and some of these governments that effectively the world put into place that act as the modern day kind of like slave master. So when they refer to sweatshops, as far as like, let's say Asia, Africa, and South America, that's the analogy is that the master is basically, let's say, the president of the country, and they're more than happy to work with the multinationals in order to basically export a lot of products for U.S. consumer demand, while basically all these multinationals in America are promoting equality to basically empower as many people into the workforce to buy all this trash. And that, yeah, so the long story short is that being here, you kind of see that, and it's really honed on to me about what's really happening in the world. And I understand that these subjects and issues are super political for people, but I'm all about realpolitik, and I just see it. It's just so abundantly clear. And I don't think everyone in the world is aware of what's really happening.
Well, look, at this point, increasingly, the main thing that the U.S. produces is dollars. I mean, we don't produce much anymore, and we just ship lots and lots of Federal Reserve notes or Federal Reserve credits outside the U.S., and in return, people send us nice things like cars and electronics. That's going to come to an end, along with the dominance of the dollar and so forth. But, Peter, we have a problem, and that is that I'm supposed to be on a pre-scheduled podcast starting in 3 minutes, so I've got to buzz off.
Okay. So thank you very much, Doug. I'll just cut it off from here. But thank you so much. It was really nice catching up again.